The Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Solomon Islands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, I take the floor to speak on this important agenda in my national capacity. Solomon Islands is following with great concern the developments in Ukraine and deeply worried about the worsening situation. As a peace-loving nation, Solomon Islands reiterated its principled position for peaceful coexistence, non-interference, refrain from the use of threat or force against the territorial integrity of any state. We deeply regret the intervention into Ukraine by its neighbor, the Russian Federation, and call for immediate de-escalation of the situation. In that respect, we call on all to exercise maximum restraint, put aside all provocation, and restore our faith in our rule-based international order, as we preserve and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Solomon Islands calls on all parties to settle international disputes by peaceful means. We welcome talks currently taking place between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. We call on all parties to listen more and better understand each other. We trust that this dialogue will bring a glimmer of hope for a sustainable, peaceful outcome. We fully support efforts made by the UN Secretary General and call for a global unified approach to support the talks, embracing diplomacy and dialogue over confrontation and hostile postures in Ukraine and the region. Solomon Islands further call on all countries to preserve the principles, spirit, and purpose of the United Nations Charter with open hands of friendship, and not with a clenched fist. We in the present must look to the past as we chart our way forward. We must never forget the United Nations was created under the ashes of a world war. My people of Solomon Islands have lived through what consequences a world war can bring. Never again must the world go through another. Never again must humankind suffer its brutal consequences. We are already inundated with global challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and sea level rise. As a small, vulnerable state, Solomon Islands is deeply concerned that the situation in Ukraine is diverting much needed attention to our global development agenda as we continue to combat climate change, improve the quality of all people, and deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. Solomon Islands stand in solidarity with all who have lost loved ones and express great concern on the worsening humanitarian situation. We commend initiatives of neighboring states to protect the lives of the vulnerable population. We need each other more during this difficult period. Let us use the multilateral tools available to seek permanent peace, for the stakes are just too high if we fail. Solomon Islands will vote in support of this resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Solomon Islands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, At the outset, we welcome the convening of this emergency special session. We thank you, Mr. President and Mr. Secretary General, in this regard. This emergency special session is timely, and it would allow all countries, small and big, to raise our voices on the serious situation Ukraine is facing and our concern in the state of affairs of this universal organ, the United Nations. Myanmar always adheres to and takes firm position on the territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty of all countries. Therefore, Myanmar condemns the invasion of Ukraine and unprovoked attacks against the people of Ukraine. These acts are flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. Myanmar calls on to respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We have been following with great concern the situation on the ground in Ukraine. It is regrettable that the situation is further escalating with intensifying attacks of the Russian Federation. As a result, many people have been killed and hundreds of thousands of people left their home. The people are suffering even in the severe cold weather. We call on immediate cessation of hostilities and attacks on Ukraine. Myanmar understands and shares more than others the suffering that the people of Ukraine are encountering. The people of Myanmar are facing similar horrible suffering resulted from the inhumane acts, atrocities, crimes against humanity committed by the Myanmar military. Due to the military's excessive use of force and indiscriminate attacks on people, as well as their inhumane and brutal acts, many houses, religious facilities, healthcare facilities, schools, and farmland have been destroyed. And accordingly, hundreds of thousands of people have to leave their respective places and became displaced people in addition to number of people dead and injured. The displaced people and victims include people from vulnerable groups such as people with disability, elderly people, women, girls, and children. I wish to commend the neighboring countries of Ukraine, which opened their borders and extend warm reception of Ukrainians and other nationals who escaped from the terrifying attacks. We also thank all member states who support Ukraine in every possible way. I appeal them to continue to do so and do more. Mr. President, the UN Charter clearly begins with, I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," end quote. I wish to further recall that, quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institutions of method that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest," end quote. Excellencies, dear colleagues, it is time for all of us to stand with justice and stand with the principle of the UN Charter. Myanmar stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. In doing so, Myanmar co-sponsors the draft resolution and will vote yes. Justice, freedom, and peace must prevail all over the world. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Myanmar. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, Pakistan is committed to the fundamental principles of the UN Charter: self-determination of peoples, non-use or threat of use of force, sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and pacific settlement of disputes. Equally, Pakistan upholds the principle of equal and indivisible security for all. These principles must be consistently and universally respected. Mr. President, Pakistan remains deeply concerned at the recent turn of events. This reflects a failure of diplomacy. Prime Minister Imran Khan has regretted the latest situation between Russia and Ukraine and said that Pakistan hoped that diplomacy could avert military conflict. We have since repeatedly stressed the need for de-escalation, renewed negotiations, sustained dialogue, and continuous diplomacy. All efforts must be made to avoid further escalation of violence and loss of life, as well as military, political, and economic tensions, which can pose an unprecedented threat to international peace and security and global economic stability. As consistently underlined by Prime Minister Imran Khan, the developing countries are hit the hardest economically by conflict anywhere. We hope that the talks initiated between the representatives of the Russian Federation and Ukraine will succeed in bringing about a cessation of hostilities and normalization of the situation. A diplomatic solution in accordance with relevant multilateral agreements, international law, and the provisions of the UN Charter is indispensable. Pakistan also supports all efforts to provide humanitarian relief to civilians in the affected areas. The government of Pakistan is most concerned about the safety and welfare of Pakistani citizens and students in Ukraine. The majority of them have been evacuated. Those who remain will be evacuated soonest. We appreciate the cooperation of the Ukrainian authorities, as well as the Polish, Romanian, and Hungarian governments in this context. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Djibouti.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, at the outset, Djibouti welcomes the convening of this emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly to address an urgent matter: the unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. It is a matter of deep regret that the Security Council failed to act in unison after the veto cast by Russia, thus effectively undermining the capacity of this vital organ to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security. We often lament the inability of the Council to respond decisively to emerging crises. The refusal expressed by a majority of member states to be paralyzed into inaction is a testament to the commitment of member states to ensure that the UN remains relevant in the face of vexing and complex security challenges. Djibouti unequivocally condemns what is, in our view, constitutes an egregious breach of international law and the most fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, in particular the obligation of all states under Article 2 of the United Nations Charter to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. If a country has legitimate security concerns, we urge that country to prioritize using tools as expressly contemplated by Article 33 of the Charter, which obligates parties to a dispute that is likely to endanger peace and security to seek its solution among other means, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or judicial settlement. We welcome the offer of good offices made by the Secretary General and reiterate the call by the African Union to establish an immediate ceasefire and to open political negotiations without delay under the auspices of the United Nations in order to preserve the world from the consequences of planetary conflict. No argument, no pretext can justify the use of force, the all-out war, and the brutal violence unleashed on Ukraine and its people. Mr. President, we are appalled by the continued attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. We are heartsick to watch the gut-wrenching images of civilians fleeing the violence and seeking refuge in neighboring countries. We echo the call made by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the High Commissioner for Refugees for unimpeded humanitarian access so that aid is delivered to those in need. Ukrainians may have decided to valiantly defend their country and not surrender, but if the war does not stop now, they may not survive. As a distinguished Ukrainian representative powerfully stated, if Ukraine does not survive, international law will not survive. The aggression against Ukraine places under stress the system of international law and international relations that the Charter put into place. Let us not allow decades of efforts to strengthen the rule of law and revitalize multilateralism go down the drain. Djibouti will therefore vote yes to reaffirm its solidarity to the people of Ukraine. It will vote yes to uphold the UN Charter. It will vote yes to reject the use of armed force and any pretext in aggression against a sovereign country. It will vote yes in support to the sanctity of borders. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes rassurés par les mesures prises pour faire face aux actes de discrimination à l'égard d'Africains qui ont ému nos populations à travers le continent. Cependant, nous sommes alarmés par la persistance de représentations qui marquent du sceau du négatif l'Africain, ainsi que par le traitement médiatique de soi-disant experts qui opèrent une distinction entre les réfugiés fuyant les conflits au Moyen-Orient et les réfugiés fuyant la guerre en Ukraine. Les conflits sont les mêmes partout où ils se produisent et ils génèrent souvent les mêmes conséquences dévastatrices. Nous sommes à un moment crucial de l'histoire des Nations Unies. Nous devons mettre fin au conflit et tout mettre en œuvre afin de prévenir que de nouveaux ne naissent. C'est à notre portée. Nous en avons les ressources. Mobilisons ensemble la volonté politique dans ce sens. Merci de votre attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Djibouti. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bhutan.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, we meet today in this August Assembly for the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly to address the alarming situation in Ukraine, a fellow member state of our United Nations. It is significant that owing to deadlock in the UN Security Council, this is the first time in 40 years that the provisions of the Uniting for Peace resolution are being invoked. Bhutan has closely observed with deep concern the rapidly escalating conflict on the ground. We join others in calling for the respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Perched atop the Himalayas, even the folds of our mighty mountains cannot shield us from the reverberations of events thousands of miles away. Today, core principles of the UN Charter and a rules-based international order are at stake, endangering international peace and security far beyond the borders of Ukraine and Europe. Mr. President, each and every one of us, big and small, rich and poor alike, have, on admission to the United Nations, ascribed to the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter. Bhutan made that solemn pledge over 50 years ago. These are principles all member states are beholden to, but for small states, they serve as the guarantor of our existence. Bhutan is a small and peace-loving country, firmly avowed to peaceful coexistence and good neighborly relations between states. Bhutan adds its voice to the chorus within this hall in defense of the UN Charter, in defense of the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. The threat or use of force and acts of aggression against another sovereign state can never be accepted. We cannot condone the unilateral redrawing of international borders. Bhutan will therefore support the resolution which is now before the Assembly, and in doing so, we reaffirm the call for the respect of international law and the core principles of the UN Charter. In closing, Mr. President, Bhutan expresses its regret at the reports of growing numbers of casualties and loss of innocent lives as a result of the crisis in Ukraine. Our hearts and prayers go out to the families of those who have lost their lives in the escalating conflict and the hundreds of thousands of others who have been displaced and suffer in its wake. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bhutan. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, as a peace-loving nation, the Lao PDR firmly upholds the principles of the United Nations Charter and its obligation under the international law. Towards this end, the Lao PDR has continued to pursue its consistent policy of peace, independence, friendship, and cooperation with all nations. As a country previously suffered from the scourge of war, the Lao PDR knows too well the endless negative consequences it will cause to the innocent lives. We believe what is entailing is not of the interest to any party. The Lao PDR has been closely following the current developments in Ukraine, which is complex and fragile. We commend the UN and countries which have offered humanitarian assistance to the affected people. Mr. President, we remain skeptical of the unilateral sanction. On the contrary, we would also be mindful that the sanctions imposed could entail long-term impact on innocent people, including the global community at large, especially during the pandemic period. Therefore, we call on all parties concerned to refrain from any action that could further fuel the escalation of tension and seek peaceful solutions and restore peace and security. Towards this end, we support the ongoing effort to find a peaceful settlement to this situation through diplomatic means, including the recent peaceful negotiation held at the border of Belarus. It is important that legitimate security concerns of all parties be taken into account. Mr. President, we have heard at this emergency special session during the past 2 days divergent views and opinions. Nevertheless, one common call loudly echoed in this assembly hall is the call for peace. which can only be achieved through diplomatic means. It is our fervent hope that through this diplomatic effort, peace can be restored. Peace which constitutes the heart and soul of our organizations, United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Cambodia expressed its grave concern on the situation unfolding and human suffering, as well as for the loss of life in Ukraine. We strongly believe that a lasting peace can be achieved only through a peaceful dialogue and negotiation. All parties must ensure that all civilian and civilian infrastructure are protected. Access to humanitarian assistance to the people in and around Ukraine must be ensured during this difficult time. Cambodia fully supports the Secretary General's effort in addressing the humanitarian crisis and to find a peaceful solution in Ukraine. On 26 February, the ASEAN Foreign Minister released a statement urging the concerned parties to seek a peaceful resolution in accordance with international law, the principle of the UN Charters. Cambodia has its firm position that all member states must respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other member states. With that, Cambodia has co-sponsored the draft resolution and will vote yes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Mr. President, the situation in and around Ukraine is a source of extreme concern, which necessitates urgent actions to de-escalate and find peaceful solution in accordance with international law. Azerbaijan deeply regrets that the ongoing crisis continues to cause significant casualties, in particular among civilian population. We express our deep condolences to the families of those perished and wounded. We call for strict adherence to international humanitarian law. Civilian lives and civilian infrastructures must be protected and safeguarded at all times. The evolving humanitarian crisis on the ground requires expedient measures to alleviate the impact of current situation on civilians. Proceeding from this understanding, Azerbaijan has already rendered, on a bilateral basis, humanitarian assistance of medicine and medical equipment and other first-need essentials to the people of Ukraine. This situation needs to be settled through peaceful diplomatic means in full compliance with the norms and principles of international law, guiding interstate relations, including respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and inviolability of borders. Strict compliance with the norms and principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, and the fulfillment in good faith of the obligations assumed by states are of the greatest importance for the maintenance of international and regional peace and security. Azerbaijan reiterates its call for dialogue without delay to prevent the situation from the further escalating escalation and underlining the necessity of direct negotiations between the parties. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Уважаемый господин председатель, уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь, Республика Беларусь проголосует против данного проекта резолюции. Мы все несем свою долю ответственности за то, что происходит сейчас на Украине. 8 лет назад были подписаны Минские соглашения. Совет Безопасности принял соответствующую резолюцию. Ни Совет Безопасности, ни Генеральная Ассамблея, ни международное сообщество в целом не смогли убедить или заставить украинские власти выполнять положения этих документов. Все эти 8 лет Украина фактически находилась в состоянии гражданской войны, поскольку киевские власти не желали садиться за стол переговоров со своими согражданами из Донецка и Луганска и отказывались учитывать их законные интересы. Все эти 8 лет в Донецкой и Луганской народных республиках гибли люди, в основном гражданское население, старики, женщины, дети. Оперативный параграф 8 внесенной резолюции, проекта резолюции, лицемерно призывает все стороны выполнять Минские соглашения. Очень хочется спросить авторов и соавторов этого проекта: где вы были все, господа? Почему вы за эти 8 лет так и не смогли заставить Киев выполнить положение этих документов? Под бесцеремонным давлением со стороны США, Канады, стран Евросоюза, которые, естественно, считают себя эталоном демократии, оказались и ООН, и ОБСЕ, и Совет Европы, и вообще все международное сообщество, которые так и не нашли в себе сил и мужества отреагировать, адекватно отреагировать на преступные действия украинских властей. Нас спрашивают, зачем вы вообще вспоминаете события прошлого сейчас, когда в ходе вооруженного конфликта гибнут люди? А наш ответ на самом деле очень прост. Мы так и не извлекли надлежащих, правильных уроков из событий Второй мировой войны. Международное сообщество так и не осознало, что любые ростки неонацизма в любой стране должны быть немедленно уничтожены. То, что происходит сегодня в этом зале и за его пределами, является очередной яркой демонстрацией, очередным ярким подтверждением двойных стандартов со стороны США и их союзников, жертвами преступлений которых уже стали сотни тысяч людей в Югославии, Ираке, Ливии, Афганистане. Мы категорически отвергаем обвинения в адрес Беларуси в вовлеченности в незаконное использование силы против Беларуси. Я вам открою страшную тайну. Мы действительно вовлечены. Президент Республики Беларусь Александр Лукашенко лично предпринял максимальные усилия для того, чтобы обеспечить контакты между российской и украинской сторонами. Наша вовлеченность сегодня таким образом заключается в организации переговоров между Российской Федерацией и Украиной и в обеспечении всего необходимого для их проведения. И мы искренне желаем успехов участникам переговоров. Многие страны в своих выступлениях ни слова не сказали об этих переговорах. Мы понимаем, что они никогда не произнесут название нашей страны в положительном или хотя бы в нейтральном ключе. Хочется спросить этих людей, вас всех, вы просто не хотите упоминать Беларусь или вы не желаете успеха этим переговорам? В качестве реакции на события на Украине некоторые страны привычно схватились за свой излюбленный инструмент – санкции. Мы хотим вас предупредить, именно вы будете нести всю ответственность за то, что применение санкций в отношении, например, белорусских калийных удобрений приведет к обострению экономических и социальных проблем и росту голода и в ваших собственных странах, и в странах, которые находятся за тысячи километров от Беларуси. Объявленные санкции уже не являются точечными. Они направлены на удушение экономики и ухудшение уровня жизни людей. Применяемые сегодня санкции, некоторые договорились до того, что объявляется экономическая война. Это худшее проявление экономического и финансового терроризма. Представители некоторых государств рапортуют о полной открытости их границ для выезда из Украины украинцев и иностранцев, граждан третьих стран. На этой якобы открытой границе, сообщаю вам, граждане Беларуси и России, в частности, все мужчины старше 18 лет, сталкиваются с огромными проблемами при попытках выезда из Украины. Украинские власти не выпускают их из страны, и россияне и белорусы фактически удерживаются в качестве заложников. Известны также случаи проявления расизма и дискриминации, избиения и выкидывания через границу иностранных граждан польскими пограничниками. 26 февраля польские пограничники избили и выдворили обратно на Украину группу из примерно 100 индийских студентов, которые в последующем были благополучно размещены в лагере для беженцев в Румынии. К нам в Минске, в Беларуси, поступают многочисленные обращения как от граждан Беларуси, так и от посольств тех стран, ваших стран, граждане которых хотели бы выехать в Беларусь для возвращения домой. С нашей стороны граница открыта. Мы готовы принимать как белорусов, так и рассматривать обращения о въезде граждан третьих стран. Мы призываем украинскую сторону отозваться на наши призывы и открыть гуманитарные коридоры или хотя бы один гуманитарный коридор для выезда в Беларусь через белорусско-украинскую границу. Мы уже официально обратились с этой просьбой, настоятельной просьбой, в представительство ООН и Международного комитета Красного Креста в Минске. Вызывает серьезное беспокойство разгул издевательств и мародерства, в том числе в отношении иностранцев на Украине. Бесконтрольная раздача оружия уже привела к резкому всплеску насилия и грабежей. Жертвами становятся обычные люди. Например, водители-дальнобойщики, которые осуществляют международные перевозки грузов. Среди них уже есть погибшие. Почему вы все замалчиваете эти факты? Кстати, насколько нам известно, на уровне руководства Африканского Союза были уже сделаны соответствующие заявления. Беларусь потеряла треть населения во Второй мировой войне. Мы хорошо знаем цену человеческой жизни. Мы скорбим по всем погибшим за последние 8 лет в Донецкой и Луганской народных республиках, в Киеве. Мы скорбим по людям, которые были заживо сожжены в Одессе. Мы скорбим по всем, кто погибает сегодня. Только переговоры могут остановить кровопролитие. Беларусь уже сделала многое и продолжает делать все возможное для урегулирования конфликта. В любой войне у каждой стороны есть своя правда. Любая война имеет собственную динамику, и по мере ее продолжения становится все более ожесточенной, что мы сегодня и наблюдаем. Мы все буквально тонем в море, в потоке лжи и дезинформации, которые распространяются информационными террористами. По-другому я этих людей назвать не могу. Абсолютное большинство из которых при этом сидит в удобных креслах, в теплых кабинетах за тысячи километров от зоны боевых действий. Через несколько минут мы все приступим к голосованию по внесенному проекту резолюции. Этот проект на самом деле должен состоять из одного параграфа, написанного не на ООНовском языке, а на нормальном человеческом языке. Он должен содержать призыв к немедленному прекращению военных действий и проведению переговоров. Я понимаю, что у каждого из вас есть инструкции из столицы. Я также знаю, что некоторых из вас очень настойчиво просили проголосовать за этот проект. И я не имею никаких иллюзий по поводу того, какими будут результаты нашего голосования. И все-таки я прошу вас еще раз подумать и проголосовать по совести, хотя я понимаю, что за голосование по совести в ООН можно потерять работу. Благодарю вас за внимание.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow delegates, to all those who dedicate themselves to the noble mission of this institution. Today, we call on Russia to stop its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We call on Russia to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We call on another neighbor of Ukraine, Belarus, who you've just heard from, to stop supporting the war and stop allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. And today, we stand together in holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law and to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding before our eyes. This is an extraordinary moment. For the first time in 40 years, the Security Council has convened an emergency special session of the General Assembly. 40 years. Most of the men and women fighting in Ukraine were not even born the last time the United Nations came together in this way to unite for peace. And I would venture that many of the people in this room were not born when that happened. But a few of the eldest Ukrainians and Russians might recall a moment like this, a moment when one aggressive European nation invaded another without provocation to claim the territory of its neighbor. A moment when a European dictator declared he would return his empire to its former glory, an invasion that caused a war so horrific that it spurred this organization into existence. Now, at more than any other point in recent history, the United Nations is being challenged. If the United Nations has any purpose, it is to prevent war. It is to condemn war, to stop war. That is our job here today. It is the job you were sent here to do, not just by your capitals, but by all of humanity. A lot has happened very quickly to bring us to this unique moment. It was barely a week ago when, in the dead of night, President Putin launched a full-scale invasion of our fellow UN member state. At the very moment the Security Council was holding an urgent meeting attempting to foster diplomacy and de-escalation. As the Security Council discussed peace, Putin declared war. Ukraine has defended itself with great courage and vigor. As President Biden said in his State of the Union address last night, President Putin, and I quote, met a wall of strength he never imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. But the brazen and indiscriminate nature of Russia's attack has had devastating, horrific consequences for the entire country. Russia has bombed residential apartment buildings. It has bombed sacred burial grounds. It has shelled kindergartens and orphanages and hospitals. Russia has spurred mass hunger and caused so many to flee their homes. The latest UN estimate are marching toward 1 million people. We thank the countries who have opened their borders, who have opened their hearts, opened their homes to those fleeing Ukraine. And I want to echo the UN Refugee Agency's call to help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees. For those who remain, Russia is destroying critical infrastructure, vital services which provide millions of people across Ukraine with drinking water to stay alive, gas to keep people from freezing to death. And now it appears Russia is preparing to increase the brutality of its campaign against Ukraine. We have seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which has no place on the battlefield. That includes cluster munitions and vacuum bombs, which are banned under the Geneva Convention. We all have seen the 40-mile-long lethal convoy charging toward Kyiv. President Putin continues to escalate, putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, threatening to invade Finland and Sweden. At every step of the war, Russia has betrayed the United Nations. Russia's actions go against everything this body stands for. People across the world have already united together in exactly the way this General Assembly must do today. Protests and vigils against Russia's war and in solidarity with Ukraine, marked with blue and yellow, have sprung up across the globe. These are protests for peace. From Bangkok to Budapest, from Berlin to Buenos Aires, from Sydney to Seoul, from Calgary to Cape Town, and even in Moscow and Minsk, people everywhere are standing up to call for President Putin to stop this attack. The Russian people are themselves asking how many lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. And they are appalled at the answer. To the Russian protesters, I say thank you. Thank you for your bravery. To the Russian soldiers sent to the front lines of an unjust, unnecessary war, I say your leaders are lying to you. Do not commit war crimes. Do everything you can to put down your weapons and leave Ukraine. The truth is that this war was one man's choice and one man alone, President Putin. It was his choice to force hundreds of thousands of people to stuff their lives into backpacks and flee the country, to send newborn babies into makeshift bomb shelters, to make children with cancer huddle in hospital basements, interrupting their treatment, essentially sentencing them to death. Those were President Putin's choices. Now it's time for us to make ours. The United States is choosing to stand with the Ukrainian people. We are choosing, in coordination with our allies and partners, to impose severe consequences on Russia. We are choosing to hold Russia accountable for its actions, and we will soon turn to vote on a resolution that does just that. We believe this is a simple vote. Vote yes if you believe UN member states, including your own, have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Vote yes if you believe Russia should be held to account for its actions. Vote yes if you believe in upholding the UN Charter and everything this institution stands for. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Observer State of the Holy See.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, thank you for calling this emergency special session, as in recent days we have been shaken by something tragic, war. The Holy See joins the many member states and millions across the globe who call for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and the return to diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, the organization has founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It is the duty of all states to seek to resolve disputes through negotiation, mediation, or by other peaceful means, even when war has commenced. Mr. President, last Sunday, Pope Francis expressed his closeness with all who now suffer as a result of the conflict, stressing that, and I quote, "It is urgent to open humanitarian corridors, and those fleeing must be welcomed." With heart broken by what is happening in Ukraine, and let us not forget the wars in other parts of the world, I repeat, put down your weapons. Those who love peace reject war as an instrument of aggression against the freedom of other peoples and as a means for the settlement of international disputes. End of quote. The Holy See wishes to express, also in this forum, its appreciation to those states which are offering humanitarian assistance to those in need, both in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, in which many Ukrainians have sought safety. Mr. President, Pope Francis has called on believers and non-believers alike to observe this Wednesday, 2nd of March, as a day to be close to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, to feel that we are all brothers and sisters, and to implore of God the end of this war. The Holy See is convinced that there is always time for goodwill. There is still room for negotiations. There is still a place for the exercise of a wisdom that can prevent the predominance of partisan interest safeguard the legitimate aspiration of everyone, and spare the world from the folly and horrors of war. May this emergency special session advance efforts that help attain this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished representatives, the Sovereign Order of Malta, a sovereign entity which provides global humanitarian aid with a special mission to serving the sick and the poor, has observed with great sadness and regret the ongoing conflict which has impacted the lives of so many citizens of Ukraine and which is currently created an unprecedented flow of refugees seeking peace and security across their nation's borders. In 8 years of conflict, the Order's embassy to Ukraine has provided considerable support, advice, and material help to Ukrainian citizens and to non-Ukrainian residents of the country who are in need. The current crisis is seeing multiple cities and towns attacked and bombed, forcing families to leave their homes and seeking shelter elsewhere. Our representatives and ambassadors in the region report that while refugees have sufficient means to travel and find refuge on their own or enjoy dual citizenship with nearby nations, the majority do not have the resources to provide for themselves without support. UN agencies predict that a potential refugee exodus of over 6 million persons might well be the outcome of this situation. In the meanwhile, many elderly people and those who are sick or disabled in some way are unable to escape the bombing and the stress that accompanies civil unrest. Our concern, obviously, is for them as much as it is for those who have managed to leave. Our staff and volunteers in major population centers within Ukraine continue to provide assistance as much as is feasible, given the ongoing security and safety problems. This past weekend, we held a summit of our regional ambassadors and aid providers under the auspices of our international relief agency, Malteser International. At that time, we were able to review both the growing extent of the refugee crisis as well as the initiatives we are taking to support the growing swell of primarily mothers and children and a small number of senior citizens. As of this morning, it is estimated that almost 700,000 individuals have made the journey across the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Moldavia. And each day that the conflict continues, the flow of anguished families will grow. We have seen some nations go out of their way to welcome these individuals and to help them through the trauma. Our Order of Malta staff along the border with Ukraine totals over 5,000 personnel, with tens of thousands of volunteers doing everything from serving hot food and drink, caring for the victims of injury and accident, providing counseling and emotional support, and assisting in securing of short-term accommodation. Volunteers from locations away from the border, many of them from other countries, representing churches and community groups, have driven their cars and vans to provide transportation to new arrivals to ensure that they are given every opportunity to find a place to stay. We are coordinating our activities with international aid agencies, such as the Red Cross and the UNHCR, and are engaged in an international fundraising program to ensure that adequate resources continue to be available for the support and maintenance of those in need. We are encouraged that the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva will be holding a debate on human rights in Ukraine today. Representatives from our government will be participating in this important discussion. We appeal to nations of goodwill to appreciate the trauma experienced by all refugees. In particular, we appeal to countries who are receiving refugees to extend the same welcome they're offering Ukrainians, to those of other national and ethnic groups who have been caught in this conflict and who are seeking security. The offer of help and support must cross ethnic, racial, and cultural lines and not be tainted by discriminatory acts or attitudes. This conflict in Europe drives home the realization that the issues of internally displaced persons and the needs of refugees forced from their homes affects the whole world: Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and now Europe. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, International IDEA strongly condemns the unprovoked war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation with the involvement of Belarus against Ukraine, a sovereign nation and a democracy. This is in breach of international law and international agreements and a rules-based international order that underpins the shared objective of global peace and the existence of organizations such as International IDEA. The invasion order by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. As firm believers in the rights of peoples to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms, we convey our full support to and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They are innocent victims of this aggression. We salute the brave partners and democracy activists with whom International IDEA has engaged in recent years when Ukraine made huge progress towards being a stable and thriving democracy. We call on the international community to spring into action to protect them and mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the invasion. We cannot fail to note that the military operation was launched while the UN Security Council was meeting to discuss the crisis. We reiterate our firm belief that international crises should be addressed through the means of multilateral diplomacy and resolved on the basis of the principles of the Charter. It is particularly unfortunate that this naked rejection of these principles happens during a pandemic that has rendered evident the need for increased global cooperation to make the world governable and to achieve justice for all. In these days, we are witnessing what an unchecked ruler, for decades trampling fundamental rights and freedoms of his own citizens, can do to undermine peace and democracy beyond his own borders. Ukraine is a country that has successfully reached democratic standards over the past 2 decades, from respecting media freedoms to free and fair elections, local democracy, and the fight against corruption. It is no wonder President Putin is scared of such democratic vibrancy at his doorstep. This is a pivotal moment for Democrats all over the world to stand united in support of Ukraine. It is also the moment to reinforce action to counter and to prevent the rise of authoritarian regimes elsewhere, which cannot survive without kleptocracy and the systematic violation of human rights and freedoms. We call on Russia to immediately withdraw its military forces and fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Revanchist interpretations of history and attempts to change borders based on ethno-nationalist fantasies offer not a luminous path for humanity, but a route towards darkness and endless cycles of violence. They certainly don't provide any hope to the younger and unborn generations that will bear the brunt of the climate crisis, or to the billions of vulnerable people around the world that are yet to realize the promise of a life free from fear and want, and the promise of the Agenda 2030. Those are the real challenges of our age. We encourage the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to make use of his good offices to advance ceasefire talks, humanitarian access to the war-affected areas, and protection of civilians, and particularly the most vulnerable ones. We urge UN member states to adopt and enforce sanctions against the Russian Federation until withdrawal of their forces from Ukraine and the full restoration of its territorial integrity. We urge UN member states to do whatever it takes in compliance with the principles of the UN Charter to stop this war and prevent any further escalation of conflict. International IDEA will do its part in collaboration with the United Nations, our member states, and other democratic governments and organizations to protect in Ukraine and elsewhere the principle that every country has a right to freely determine its own fate on the basis of the will of the people, freely expressed. Democracy's institutions and processes are the best means to protect their right. Today, we must stand up for these principles. Today, we must stand up for Ukraine, which embodies these principles and defends them to our greatest respect. Diakuyu, thank you.
I thank the distinguished observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of the consideration of Agenda Item 5. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council S/2014/136, to take action on a draft resolution issued as document A/ES-11/L1. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L1.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates, we are living through a defining moment for our generation. Our generation is the generation that was supposed by our predecessors to be saved from scourge of war. That is why our predecessors created the United Nations. And yet today, it falls to us to save future generations. Let me read the following text. Our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have, however objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is an illegal means for settling those grievances or for altering those conditions. It may be that the nation faced desperate problems that would have warranted the boldest measures short of war. All other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, were open to an aggrieved country. But aggressive warfare was outlawed. The defendants did make aggressive war a war in violation of treaties. They did attack and invade their neighbors in order to effectuate a foreign policy which they knew could not be accomplished by measures short of war. And that is as far as we accuse or propose to inquire. End of quote. Said in his opening statement to the International Military Tribunal on November 21, 1945, in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, Chief of Counsel. And these words are addressed today to Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Volodin, Ms. Matvienko, and perhaps dozens more, but certainly they are not addressed to the Russian citizens, those Russian citizens who try to preserve their dignity. For almost a week, Ukraine is fighting under the bombs and missiles, fighting in the face of armadas of hardware and countless crowds of enemies. They have come to the Ukrainian soil not only to kill some of us, not only to shift our course and priorities. They have come to deprive Ukraine of the very right to exist. They have come to resolve the Ukrainian issue, as their propagandists claimed. Just stop and think whether these words remind you of something. Yes, more than 80 years ago, another dictator tried to finally resolve the issue of another people. He failed. When the world responded in a resolute and united manner, it was happened immediately, and the delay costed dozens of millions of people. Are we ready to pay such a price now? Or is it time to demonstrate the unity of purpose and deeds already now? We appreciate all manifestations of such unity and solidarity with Ukraine. I would like to express gratitude to all member states that support Ukrainians in their battle for freedom. I would also like to thank those member states that accepted Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children. More than 500,000 have already fled from Russian missiles and shells. I will not recite all facts of new war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Russian troops have committed since my previous statement 2 days ago. The list is so long that it will run out of time. The crimes are so barbaric that it is difficult to comprehend. Facing the total resistance of the Ukrainian population, Putin's regime has proceeded to widespread use of indiscriminate weapons such as multiple rocket launchers and aerial bombs against the residential areas. Ukrainians are being killed by Russian ballistic missiles and thermobaric weapons. Just yesterday, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zhytomyr, Mariupol, Melitopol, and many other cities and towns sustained heavy shellings that killed dozens of innocents, including children. Ukraine deeply regrets that a student from India has become a victim of this shelling by the Russian armed forces in Kharkiv. We offer our deepest sympathies to India and the relatives of the victim. A Chinese citizen was also injured in another Ukrainian city because of Russia's deadly attacks. The Ukrainian and foreign citizens have become hostages of the Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. In Kyiv, Russian murderers hit the city TV tower, killing 5 passerbys. One of the missiles dropped on the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial, a sacred place of commemoration of Jews, Ukrainians, Roma, and representatives of other ethnic groups killed by Nazis during the World War II. What an irony when victims of Nazis are being killed for the second time by Nazi modern followers. As the President of Ukraine asked, what was the point of repeating the slogan, "Never again," in 80 years? It's already clear that the goal of Russia is not an occupation only. It is genocide. On 7th and 8th of March 2022, the International Court of Justice will hold public hearings in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. Also, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has decided to proceed with opening of a formal investigation into the situation in Ukraine. Unprovoked escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine gives reasons to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC continue to be committed on the territory of Ukraine. Along with the situation in Crimea and Donbass, recent events suggest that aggressors' troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dear colleagues, one might consider, observing the bloodshed in Ukraine, that it is not my war. It is a mistake. The evil will never stop. It requires more and more space to conquer. If tolerated, it advances further and further. The draft resolution is one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop it, to stop in Ukraine and not to let it go further. The wall that will protect all of you, in particular younger generations. Distinguished delegates, by voting today, you also reconfirm your country's commitment to the UN Charter. After the vote, I invite you, ambassadors and representatives, to stop by the Indonesian lounge and to sign this little blue book. Little but of global magnitude. Every vote in favor of the resolution and every signature of country that voted in favor would be a historical reconfirmation of the Charter. It is very easy, ladies and gentlemen, to sign the Charter at time of peace. It is the duty to sign and reconfirm and implement the Charter at the time of war. So stop by the Indonesian lounge, put the name of your country if you voted in favor, and after you sign this book, I will hand it over to the Secretary General for keeping the book in his office, in front of him. So at every single moment, the Secretary General will get an inspiration from the overwhelming majority of nations who still trust in the UN, who still trust in the UN Charter. There is a very fragile gentleman, a very old one. He was born in a territory that was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He will celebrate his 102 years birthday in 9 days. His name is Benjamin Ferenc. Benjamin Ferenc was an investigator of war crimes, a chief prosecutor at one of the 12 subsequent trials of Nuremberg. Later, he became an advocate of international rule of law and for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. With the permission of the producer, I would play a couple of seconds of his words. And I want you to listen very carefully.
Hard to do. It's 3 words: law, not war. If you can do that, you save every day billions of dollars, which you can use to deal with the legitimate complaints of old people who need medical care, students who have to pay for their tuition, all the legitimate complaints which could be solved if we didn't spend the money on weapons to kill them instead of helping them. And that is the current system. Now, how are you going to do it? I will end by telling you how to do it and the principles which have guided me. There are 3 principles. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. 3, I hear you, never give up. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck.
Please show respect. Show respect to the Charter. Show respect to the Secretary General. Show respect to this gentleman who will celebrate 102 years since his birthday. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Before I open the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, Господин генеральный секретарь, уважаемые коллеги, Россия просит поставить проект резолюции на голосование. Призываем вас не поддерживать этот проект. Однако мы знаем о беспрецедентном давлении, которое наши западные партнеры оказывали на огромное количество стран, заставляя их проголосовать так, как это угодно им. Это нельзя назвать даже давлением. Это были открытые циничные угрозы. Нам об этом известно. Этот документ не будет способствовать прекращению военных действий. Наоборот, он может ободрить киевских радикалов и националистов и дальше любой ценой определять политику в стране, удерживая в заложниках мирное население. Причем не в переносном, а в прямом смысле этого слова. Сейчас именно так и происходит в ряде крупных городов Украины, где население используется в качестве живого щита. Сегодня стало известно, что вооруженные силы Украины не дают мирным жителям Мариуполя покинуть город. Удерживают их, в том числе женщин и детей, в одной из школ Мариуполя. Насильно доставляют обратно всех гражданских лиц, которые пытались покинуть город по предоставленным гуманитарным коридорам. Нам также известно и о планируемых националистическими батальонами провокациях, которые они заготовили с участием гражданского населения, с тем, чтобы впоследствии обвинить в этом российские войска. Вопреки нормам международного гуманитарного права, в жилых кварталах размещается военная техника, системы залпового огня, артиллерийские установки. Мы сегодня передадим примеры подобных действий руководству ООН, которое до настоящего момента утверждало, что не располагает подобными свидетельствами. Хотя видеоролики, снятые простыми украинскими гражданами, свободно распространяются в интернете. Ответственность за это полностью лежит на украинских властях, так же, как и за безответственную и преступную раздачу оружия всем желающим, включая выпущенных из тюрем заключенных. Это уже привело к массовым случаям грабежей, убийств и мародерства. Уважаемые коллеги, ваш отказ поддержать проект сегодня стал бы голосованием в пользу мирной Украины, свободной от радикализма и неонацизма, живущей в мире со своими соседями и отказавшейся от внешнего управления. Именно на достижение этих целей направлена наша специальная военная операция, которую авторы резолюции пытаются представить в качестве агрессии. Мы сегодня слышали от украинского представителя слова о нацизме, но он стыдливо умолчал о разгуле неонацизма на самой Украине, о бесчинствах неонацистских и националистических радикальных организаций, о факельных шествиях и прославлении пособников Гитлера. Те, кто интересовался развитием украинского кризиса, прекрасно понимают его генезис. Действуя сегодня, мы прежде всего стремимся остановить 8-летнюю войну майданного режима с населением Донбасса. За прошедшие годы наша страна сделала все возможное и невозможное, чтобы избежать такого сценария. Мы, по выражению генерального секретаря, кстати говоря, перевернули все камни и постучались в каждую дверь, однако так и не были услышаны. Жители Донбасса продолжали и продолжают бомбить, не собираясь останавливаться на 14 тысячах погибших, подавляющее большинство из которых приходится на жителей ДНР и ЛНР. Цели нашей специальной операции, объявленные на основании статьи 51 Устава ООН, выполняются и будут достигнуты. При этом мы не наносим ударов по гражданским объектам и мирным жителям. Не верьте огромному количеству фейков, распространяемых в интернете на этот счет. Эти фейки пеклись, как пирожки, в Центре информационно-психологических операций специальных сил операции Украины. Этот центр вчера был уничтожен. Мирный сценарий для Украины можно ускорить, если радикалы позаботятся о сохранности жизни граждан своей страны и не будут прикрываться ими. Такого призыва в тексте поставленного на голосование документа нет. В нем также ничего не сказано о незаконном перевороте в Киеве, когда в феврале 2014 года при попустительстве Германии, Франции и Польши и при поддержке Соединенных Штатов был свергнут законно избранный президент страны. В этом проекте нет ничего и о том, что новые националистические власти тотчас же ограничили права граждан на использование русского языка. Это дало старт огромной цепочке нарушений базовых прав жителей Востока страны. И не только Востока, включая самое ценное право – право на жизнь. Многие из вас не хотят ничего слышать о трагедии, которая началась на Украине после Майданного переворота 2014 года, о заживо сожженных людях в Одессе, о преследованиях и убийствах несогласных. И самым ярким проявлением этого стала развязанная Киевом война против Донбасса. Ничего в документе нет и о том, что на протяжении 8 лет Соединенные Штаты и Европа накачивали и сейчас накачивают Украину вооружением, помогая майданному режиму убивать мирных жителей на Донбассе. Оправдывали лояльные киевские власти за полное игнорирование минских договоренностей и саботаж резолюции Совета Безопасности 2202. Наконец, этот проект – это очевидная попытка тех, кто за последние десятилетия совершил бесчисленное количество агрессий, незаконных с точки зрения международного права военных операций, переворотов, одним из которых стал и майданный переворот на Украине, выставить себя поборниками международной законности. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Most sincerely regrets events taking place in the east of Europe. Russia and Ukraine have always been friendly country to the Republic of Serbia, and Serbian people perceives Russians and Ukrainians as fraternal nations. We felt loss of life of each man in Ukraine is true tragedy. The Republic of Serbia is committed to observing principles of territorial integrity and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and final act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation stated in resolution, will vote in favor of resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago, in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kind humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. سيد الرئيس، إن مشروع القرار المعروض أمامنا اليوم يمثل بوضوح نهجا منحازا يستند إلى دعاية سياسية وأداة من أدوات الضغط والابتزاز السياسي. لقد حرص معدو مشروع القرار على تضمينه لغة عدائية موجهة ضد الاتحاد الروسي تستهدف النيل من مواقفه المشروعة والمستند إلى مشاغله الأمنية وحقه في حماية أرضه وشعبه من التهديد الحقيقي للأمن القومي الروسي. ولم يقتصر الأمر على ذلك، بل طال القرار بيلاروسيا أيضاً. إن مشروع القرار هذا يمثل نفاقاً سياسياً مفضوحاً، فلو كانت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وحلفائها الغربيين جادون فعلاً في نزع فتيل التوتر في تلك المنطقة، لكانوا قد أوفوا بالوعود التي قطعوها للاتحاد الروسي قبل 3 عقود بعدم توسيع نطاق حلف الناتو شرقاً وتحويل أوكرانيا إلى مصدر تهديد مباشر وحقيقي للاتحاد الروسي، ولكانوا قد ضغطوا على سلطات كييف للالتزام باتفاقيات مينسك ووقف انتهاكات الجسيمة بحق المدنيين في دونباس. هذا ناهيك عن مسارعة تلك الدول إلى مد أوكرانيا بالأسلحة الثقيلة والصواريخ وفتح باب التطوع لمواطنيها للقتال في أوكرانيا، مما يؤشر بوضوح إلى رغبة تلك الدول في الاستفزاز والتصعيد وليس في التهدئة والاحتواء. إن عرض مشروع القرار اليوم يترافق مع ضخ إعلامي مضلل هائل وحملات كبيرة لتشويه الحقائق ونشر المعلومات الخاطئة، فهو لم يصمم للبحث عن حل حقيقي للأزمة، وإنما لشيطنة الاتحاد الروسي وتشويه صورته. إنه نص مليء بالثغرات وبعيد عن الموضوعية، ويتجاهل الأسباب الحقيقية الكامنة وراء إشعال فتيل هذه الأزمة. السيد الرئيس، إن الذين يثيرون الحماسة اليوم بشأن الدفاع عن ميثاق الأمم المتحدة كان عليهم أن يظهروا نفس الحماسة ضد استمرار إسرائيل باحتلال الأراضي العربية المحتلة وضد اعتداء القوات التركية على سيادة الأراضي السورية. وماذا عن انتهاك قوات الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لسيادة وسلامة الأراضي السورية؟ السيدات والسادة، إن رفض الجمهورية العربية السورية لسياسات الغرب في الهيمنة والتدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول الأعضاء وإشعال وإطالة أمد الأزمات ونشر الفوضى وتكريس الانتقائية والازدواجية في المعايير وفرض الإجراءات القسرية الأحادية يحتم عليها رفض مشروع القرار هذا والتصويت ضده. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, it is clear from the debate over the past 2 days that the membership of the United Nations is united in its call to end the war in Ukraine and return to diplomacy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines wishes to offer an explanation of its vote on the draft resolution before us today. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will vote in favor of the draft resolution. We will vote in accordance with our steadfast commitment to upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, which form the core of multilateralism and gave birth to our United Nations 76 years ago. It bears repeating, Mr. President, that these principles underscore respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states and enjoin member states to refrain from the threat or the use of force in the conduct of their international relations. Our support for the draft resolution is rooted in our conviction that the strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and the principles of peace, dialogue, and compromise for the preservation of humanity is not optional. As a small island developing state, full compliance with the bedrock principles of international law remains an existential issue. We take the floor again, Mr. President, to repeat our call for these principles to be applied consistently and upheld as universal truths instead of selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools to further great power ambition anywhere and by anyone. Historically, and in recent times, we have witnessed the naked hypocrisy, double standards, and cynical misapplication of international law, which we have condemned. Today, we strongly emphasize that our august assembly should apply the fundamental principles of our charter impartially, irrespective of the size, economic, and military power of the principles involved. Mr. President, in the midst of prevailing global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we simply cannot afford another conflict. War does not manage grievances. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, calls for an immediate ceasefire to avert further bloodshed, human suffering, and a global catastrophe, and to engage in peaceful dialogue to find a solution to this war post-haste. Today, we must unite for peace. Thank you, and peace profound to all.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The two-thirds majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution and in addition to delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become the co-sponsors of A/ES11/L11, Barbados and Cambodia. If any other country wish to co-sponsor A/ES11/L1, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. There is nothing further, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. The result of The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. السيد الرئيس، لقد صوتت تونس لصالح القرار اليوم انتصارا لمقاصد ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة التي انبنت عليها سياستنا الخارجية، وتأكيدا لحرص بلادنا على إنهاء الأزمة باستعمال الوسائل السلمية لفض النزاعات التي تبقى السبيل الوحيد والأمثل لوضع حد للتصعيد والحيلولة دون مزيد تدهور الأوضاع وتفاقم الأزمات والمآسي الإنسانية. لقد شهد العالم ما يكفي من ويلات الحروب والأزمات بكل تداعياتها المدمرة على حياة الناس وعلى السلم والأمن، كما علمتنا تجارب الماضي البعيد والقريب أن الخيارات العسكرية لا تحل أي أزمة، وأن الحوار والمفاوضات كفيلة بتسوية كل الخلافات وإيجاد الحلول التوافقية لها. فالأزمة الحالية في أوكرانيا تأتي في وقت بدأ العالم يتهيأ فيه للتعافي من تداعيات جائحة كوفيد والتأسيس لمرحلة جديدة قوامها التعاون والتضامن والانخراط الفاعل في تعزيز العمل المتعدد الأطراف وتحقيق أهداف أجندتنا المشتركة. ونعتقد أن العالم لا يمكنه تحمل مزيد من الأزمات بهذا الحجم والخطورة، ولذلك فإن تونس التي استبشرت بانخراط الأطراف المعنية في الحوار والتفاوض تجدد دعوتها للمجموعة الدولية من أجل تضافر الجهود وتكثيف المساعي لتشجيع هذه الأطراف على مواصلة الاحتكام إلى المفاوضات بما يساعد على وقف العمليات العسكرية وحماية الأرواح وتهيئة الظروف لإيجاد حل دائم لهذه الأزمة. وباعتبار أن الأمن والسلم الدوليين كل لا يتجزأ، فإن تونس تدعو إلى التعامل مع مختلف القضايا العادلة بمقياس واحد حتى تتمكن الشعوب من استرداد حقوقها المشروعة وفقا للمرجعيات الدولية وبناء عالم أكثر عدلا وسلاما واستقرارا. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position on the vote we just cast. Rwanda voted in favor of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, military escalation should cease immediately and go for peaceful settlement of the crisis. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the key to resolve this conflict. The external intervention will only worsen the situation. Mr. President, we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war, including the efforts of the Secretary General in solving the crisis. We urge all concerned parties to demonstrate calm and seek a solution to the conflict through dialogue to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the heaviest price. A lasting solution, Mr. President, will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, taking into account the concerns of both sides. The current war does not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it's likely to generate subsequent crises and human suffering. Rwanda also expresses.
Ladies and gentlemen of the media, the General Assembly has spoken. As Secretary General, it is my duty to stand by this resolution and be guided by its call. The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now, silence the guns now, open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. We don't have a moment to lose. The brutal effects of the conflict are plain to see. But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb. I'm also deeply concerned with its potential consequences for regional and global peace and security and the world struggling to recover from COVID. Today's resolution reflects a central truth. The world wants an end to the tremendous human suffering in Ukraine. The same truth was clear in the rapid mobilization of funds for our life-saving humanitarian operations in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Our global flash appeal was met with record generosity. I'm deeply grateful to donors for their support. With that funding in hand, we will be able to scale up the delivery of vital medical and health supplies, food, safe drinking water, shelter, and protection. Looking ahead, I will continue to do everything in my power to contribute to an immediate cessation of hostilities and urgent negotiations for peace. People in Ukraine desperately need peace, and people around the world demand it. Thank you very much.
能缓解现地局势，避免冲突升级甚至失控。俄罗斯同乌克兰已经举行首轮谈判，尽管存在分歧，双方都表现出继续推进谈判的意愿，我们对此表示欢迎。面对十分复杂敏感的形势，中方再次呼吁国际社会坚持政治解决的大方向，为当事方直接对话谈判创造有利氛围和条件。主席先生，联合国和有关各方采取的任何行动，都要以地区和平稳定为重，以各方普遍安全为重，为紧张局势降温、推动外交解决起到正面作用。遗憾的是，刚才提交本次紧急特别联大表决的这项决议草案，事先没有在全体会员国范围。
Russia is isolated and alone, and that's the cost. That the costs will keep rising until Russia relents. We have affirmed the UN Charter, pledged to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and stood together in the battle for the soul of the world. Last night, at his State of the Union address, President Biden commended the courage of the Ukrainian people. He declared that the United States of America stands with Ukraine, and quoted President Zelensky when he said, "Light will win over darkness." Today at the United Nations, light has won over darkness. 141 states voted to support this amendment. The world, as President Biden said, is choosing the side of peace and security. Now, as the situation grows graver, every day in Ukraine, we must keep the momentum going. We must do everything we can to help the Ukrainian people, to hold Russia accountable, to match our strong words with strong actions. Let us continue to come together to support the Ukrainian people, and let us demonstrate the true power and true purpose of the United Nations for all. Thank you very much.
How satisfied are you with the fact that 141 countries supported the resolution? Did you expect that?
We worked for that.
Is the number the right one? What about the humanitarian resolution? Sorry.
That's still up for
When do you
discussion.
think you are going to vote?
I can't
but
give you
it's more,
anything.
it's above your the numbers of abstention, the numbers.
We would have hoped that the 35 people who abstained would have voted yes with us as well. So it was not at our expectation. We would have hoped for more. Thank you.
Hey, good, is it morning or afternoon? I'm not sure. Look, I just want to say from the part of the European Union that last week we had the Security Council trying its best but blocked by one country, Russia, for taking its responsibility. Immediately after that happened, we got to work drafting this resolution together with Ukraine and very many other countries of the world, and today the General Assembly has taken its responsibility. The message in this resolution is very, very clear, and the voting pattern is very, very clear. Russia stands isolated. Russia has been asked by the world to pull back, stop the aggression, and seek diplomacy instead of war. We have heard so many passionate statements over the last few days manifesting what I just said, that the world has stated clearly, stop the aggression, withdraw troops, and abide by the rules of the UN Charter and protect this organization. So I just want to say, too, that the European Union and the world stands with Ukraine. I thank you very much.
Do you have a message for the countries who abstain from this resolution?
Not today. Thank you.
the Security Council will continue to be seized with the business because there is a humanitarian. All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here with my very good friend and colleague, representative of the European Union to the United Nations. Olof used to be permanent representative of Sweden, and we used to sit together on the Council during the membership of Ukraine and Sweden. It's a defining day, as I said in my statement. I'm happy to report, or rather to confirm what you saw with your own eyes. The United Nations is still alive and going through the process of catharsis. I believe in the United Nations. Now people of Ukraine have more reasons to believe in the United Nations. It is just a beginning. Don't think that it was the end in itself or a purpose in itself, the vote. The vote is a powerful message to the Russian Federation. But I need to refer you to what I said in my statement as well. I still believe that there are citizens of the Russian Federation of dignity who unfortunately right now are cut from the information about how many Russian soldiers are killed in Ukraine. And as soon as they learn the magnitude of the tragedy, I hope they will stop the dictatorship in their country and the war is going to be over. As you know, due to the actions of the Russian Federation in the Security Council last month was not able to perform its duties, and we had to move, as asked by the Security Council, in fact, to the General Assembly. Nevertheless, the Security Council remains busy with Ukrainian issues, with the Russian crisis, and I call on you to call it Russian crisis. Stop calling it Ukrainian crisis. The only country that launched this crisis was Russian Federation. So the Security Council remains busy with issues, how to address like humanitarian problems. I express my sincere gratitude to all nations who have already came forward, offered assistance in money, goods, shelter. I need to ask you to deliver my gratitude to the local authorities of every single country where the refugees are coming and finding their shelter. And those are not only the Ukrainians. I read every day the charts with the nationalities of people who fled to Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, Romania. It's like the United Nations there. I already read posts from some Africans who say they dream about coming back to beautiful Ukraine. We will rebuild Ukraine. And I tell my staff, I tell my family, the images of buildings destroyed, they are horrifying. But it does not matter at the moment. It's lives of people that matter at the moment. We will rebuild the buildings. We will rebuild every single building, or we will build something better with the help of the international community. So don't be misled by all these malarkeys of Nebenza and his cronies. And I think that the picture of the results speaks for itself. Thank you.
Can I just say one word before you go and put questions to Sergei? Sergei, my good friend, referred to the fact that Sweden, in my previous capacity, worked with Ukraine together on the Security Council. It's true that our colors of the Swedish flag happen to be blue and yellow, as are the colors of the European Union. But today, above all, those are the colors of Ukraine that we all need to carry and carry them high. I want to reemphasize what I said before. Russia is isolated. Russian aggression will not stand. Today, the world has spoken up against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olof.
Mr. Ambassador, what would you like to say to the countries that voted no?
I would like to say once again that in spite of the horrific actions by the criminal regime of Putin, we still believe that there are citizens of Russia who maintain their dignity. So when you tell me that Russia voted against, it's Putin's regime, criminals from Russia who voted against. It is regime of Belarus who voted against, because there are wonderful Belarusian people who also fight for their freedom. So make distinctions in your reporting between the criminals and between the dignity of the people oppressed in those countries.
Thank you. President Zelensky last night asked U.S. President Joe Biden to deliver a useful address regarding Ukraine. I wanted to know your thoughts about the President Biden's State of the Union regarding Ukraine. Were you satisfied?
You know, I lived in Washington and I worked in Washington for many years. I saw many presidents speaking, the American presidents, foreign presidents addressing the U.S. Congress in full session. I saw my colleague, ambassador of Ukraine, on a balcony. She was almost crying. I was watching the address by Biden in the comfort of my office, and I was almost crying. But those are not the emotions that matter. That's the resolution, the resolute posture of the American people, not just by the politicians in the Senate, by the American people that matters. The spirit of freedom and liberty is genetically in the blood of Ukrainians and Americans, of the British, of the Poles, of all freedom-loving nations on this planet. So the speech was very well received, and I'm sure that the nature of this country is that every single word of President Biden will be followed by specific actions of his government and by specific actions of the members of the U.S. Congress.
Mr. Ambassador, just about that, what action you and your government wants that the United States and the European Union...
I'm not speaking, thank you, I understood, well understood. As I said, there is a very good friend of mine, Ambassador Oksana Markarova, who is in charge of bilateral relationship, and she is 24/7 working with the U.S. government. Please address questions on the cooperation with the United States beyond the United Nations to her. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, tell me.
Ambassador, you got this overwhelming vote and majority to support your resolution. What's next in terms of the United Nations? What steps are you taking?
We are working 24/7. We are working at all levels. I have meetings with the leadership of the Secretariat. I had a meeting yesterday. We suggested certain things. We expecting certain things. I want to, before I go, I need to tell you something. My mission is overwhelmed with the support of my colleagues from all over the world. You know, I receive delegations of ambassadors and their colleagues with coffee in the morning, with some snacks in the afternoon. I receive so many calls from lawyers, from politicians, from PR companies, from lobbyists, and I say no, thank you very much. We Ukrainians are fit to do our job on our own, and we are doing our job. We will ask you when we need your help with research, with speech writing, with preparing papers. We are working with the teams of international lawyers are working in The Hague for years now on the cases opened in The Hague. But I want to take this moment to express my gratitude to every citizen of this city, to every citizen of New York, to every foreigner working for any mission in the United Nations. We are overwhelmed with your support. Go to the mission of Singapore at night. and see the Ukrainian colors. Teeny nations, small nations, brave as a tiger when it comes to the principles. And the result, as I said already, speaks for itself. Thank you very much. Have a good day.